All right, good morning. We are on week 15 of Biology B here. We only have 2 weeks left after this. So we're just going to finish up about talking about biodiversity. Next week, we will have our test over this last unit. And then the week after that, we'll have our final exam. So you guys are so close to the end. Make sure you're pushing through, getting everything done. We have, if you have any missing assignments, make sure we get those turned in as soon as possible so I can get them graded for you. Yeah, so let's pull up our class here and see what we have to take a look at. All right, so here we are, biology week 15. Again, biodiversity. You have your little quiz as normal. Here are your slides. Here's a Google Doc giving your assignments information. And then, of course, your discussion question. Friendly reminder, let's go back here to week 14 for a minute. So in week 14, I introduced this endangered species research paper here. I just want to remind you that it is 3 paragraphs long. I'm not looking for anything extensive. Just make sure you get that turned in, okay? You can just go to the website that's provided on that sheet, pick an endangered species that interests you. Maybe it's a snake, maybe it's a bear, maybe just pick one that, you really think you might enjoy learning a little bit about. Type up a quick 3 paragraphs explaining, why they're endangered, the habitat they live in, what they might be missing from their habitat, things like that. And then get that turned in. Should be really quick and easy. Okay. All right. Back to week 15. So let's jump into some biodiversity here. All right. And we're also going to talk a little bit about conservation efforts when we're talking about biodiversity, because we need to keep the biodiversity alive. So, all right, so what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is going to refer to a variety of species, different plants, animals, fungi, etc., and they're all part of an ecosystem. So we learned a little bit about what an ecosystem was last week, and I told you, you have giant ecosystems like a forest, and then you even have small ecosystems like the pothole in your driveway, okay? So how much biodiversity is there in an ecosystem really determines how stable the environment is going to be. The more biodiversity, the more stable the environment's going to be. All right, so what are the different components of biodiversity? So you have genetic diversity, which is going to be the diversity within one species, okay? These are the variety of alleles that make up an individual unique. The more genetic diversity within one species, the better off that species is going to be. You also have ecosystem diversity. So this, I think, is what we think about more often when we're thinking about biodiversity. And this is going to be the variety of ecosystems within a certain area. So yes, the entire forest is an ecosystem in itself, but there's also an ecosystem in the river. There's an ecosystem in each tree. There's an ecosystem in the lowland grasses. The more ecosystem diversity increases the chance of interbreeding, and therefore it's going to increase genetic diversity, which means the species are going to be better off. And then lastly, we have species diversity. And so this is going to be the variety of species that live within a given area, within a given ecosystem. And there should be an even mix of producers, consumers, and decomposers. We learned last week how important all of these different organisms work together, and that they're all equally as important when it comes to an ecosystem, when it comes to biodiversity. Okay, so we need a really good mix of all 3 of those, the producers, the consumers, and decomposers, so that life can function as normal. All right, now let's talk about a keystone species. So a keystone species is going to be a species that helps define an entire ecosystem. Sometimes this is a plant, sometimes it's a consumer, it sometimes might even be a decomposer. If one became extinct, there would either be a huge dramatic change to the ecosystem, or many of the other species might not survive due to the loss of that keystone species. Many keystone species sometimes are predators because they help to control a population. So right here, if you take a look here, in this example, the keystone species is the shark, because what ends up happening is the shark eats the stingrays, and then it keeps the stingrays from eating every organism here on the bottom. Without the shark, the stingrays can then overpopulate, and then they eat all of the organisms on the bottom, and then the ecosystem starts to die off because there's not a balance between the producers, the consumers, and the decomposers. So it's really important to keep those keystone species. All right, now let's talk about how do humans benefit from biodiversity? What does biodiversity help us? Sometimes I think that that's kind of all we think about. So let's talk a little bit about that. So we rely on many different organisms to live. Plants and animals, obviously, we rely on for food, but we also rely on them for clothing and plants for different shelter and medicine. Okay, most of your house, there's wood in it, so that comes from plants. And then the different medicines that we use every day, these are also from plants as well. We need to make sure that all organisms maintain biodiversity so that they don't obtain diseases and become extinct within their ecosystems. There are also some indirect benefits that we as humans can get from different biodiversity. So due to the process of photosynthesis, plants use much of the Earth's carbon dioxide, which is produced by consumers, us, okay? This rids the air of carbon dioxide, which has been a major factor in climate change. So we need the plants, we need the grasses, we need the trees, we need all of that to help rid the air of CO2 to help slow down the rate of change for climate change. Bees also have both direct and indirect benefits. They make honey that humans obviously can eat, but they also pollinate flowers, or other producers pollinate flowers. So we're able to obtain fruit from those flowers. This is, if we're talking about an apple tree in the springtime, apple tree, buds a flower first. The bee or, hummingbird, something like that, will come by and pollinate it from another flower. And then that flower will later be able to produce a fruit later in the summer. All right, so now let's talk about different factors that are going to affect biodiversity, okay? So you have exploitation of resources or different organisms. So when we're thinking about humans, this could mean overhunting. We have regulations on how many organisms, how many deer, things like that, that we can hunt. And that's to help to control the exploitation of resources and organisms. Another one is habitat loss. So we have a lot of so as you can see here, they've kind of like deforested an entire area. We have a lot of rules here in the United States where for every tree someone cuts down, they have to plant a new tree. That's to help, prevent that habitat loss. Obviously, it's not going to be the same effect. The trees are going to be smaller, but we're doing as much as we can, okay? Another one is habitat disruption. So this used to be just a free-flowing river that went from, point A to point B, and then humans came in and they built a dam. Well, that's a whole different thing for not only like the plants and trees around it, but also for the animals. This water level is obviously going to rise and create a higher water level there. And then this water level is going to be lower. You've got a waterfall that the plants and animals are not used to. So, just a total habitat disruption there. Okay. We also have habitat fragmentation. Okay. So when we come in here and, this isn't as big as a dam, but what we've done here is, we built a road right down the middle of where, a deer used to cross. Okay. So one thing we can do is we can put in these land bridges over roads, which allows, different organisms to cross from point A to point B to allow for that biodiversity, to allow for that, species diversity, and make sure that, the ecosystem is thriving. Climate change is a big one. We as humans are fighting climate change, but, as you've probably heard before, climate change is really huge for all other organisms. It's causing forest fires. It's causing more tsunamis. It's causing more hurricanes. With the ozone depleting, all of those sort of things, it's really just a serious issue that's affecting biodiversity all across the world. Then lastly, we have pollution. Okay, so the pollution that, come from our cars, from our factories, from our airplanes, from our boats, anything like that, that is all going into the air. That is affecting the ozone layer. That is affecting climate change, which then obviously is affecting biodiversity. Even just the air even just the pollution going into the air is affecting biodiversity, it might not be healthy air for plants and animals to thrive in. All right, let's talk about coral reefs for a minute. So, as we know, some of our coral reefs are dying. So, one thing that scientists are trying to do is they're trying to start a coral reef regeneration process. So, our coral reefs are mostly dying due to pollution, climate change, and then human involvement. Okay. To counter these efforts, many scientists are, we're going to take on this regeneration project. So why are they dying? So due to climate change, what's happening is the temperatures are warming in the water. And when this happens, the coral reefs become stressed, which means then they're expelling or ending their symbiotic relationship that they had with the algae that give them their color. So we talked about symbiotic relationships last week. So this is a very um, sorry. This is a very mutualistic relationship. Both the coral and the algae benefit from this relationship that they have. Okay. So if the temperature is going to stay too high in the oceans and the waters, then the algae are going to leave and stay away from the coral, and then the coral is going to survive. Okay. So in this mutualistic relationship, the algae are provided a home, and then the coral is able to eat off of the algae. Okay. If the temperature is too high and the algae leaves, one, the algae no longer have a home. Two, the corals no longer to eat off of them. And this is going to leave the coral bleached because they're going to be able to have their color. And they're also going to be vulnerable to disease. As you can see here, here's a picture. Okay, this is a nice link here that talks about, restoring coral reefs. It's a little 2-minute video that I'd love for you guys to go watch. It just talks about everything that's happening in that restoration process. All right, so now we've talked about why we as humans are affecting biodiversity. Now let's talk about a little bit about how can we conserve biodiversity to not only save ourselves as humans, but also to save all the plants, animals, decomposers in the world. We talk about how, that pothole is one ecosystem, the forest behind your house is another ecosystem. What if we think about the entire world as one giant ecosystem and we have to do everything possible we can to save it? Well, that is conserving biodiversity. So one of the first things that scientists do is they do population monitoring so that they can evaluate how the changes in the environment affect all of the populations of all the organisms. Okay, using population monitoring, scientists can determine how effective any conservation effort is. So if someone wants to, say, hey, we're going to take away plastic straws to save the turtles. Well, by using population monitoring, scientists can see, is this actually working? But here's a couple different types of population monitoring methods. So you have canopy fogging. So in canopy fogging, what you're going to do is a human's going to come through and they're going to lay a layer of fog over top of an area, which then this is typically going to be for small bugs, birds, things like that. Many of those organisms are then going to come close to the ground, which will just make them easier to count. Another thing to do is netting. So what scientists come in and do is they wrap a net around a certain area in a forest, and then they are able to count the number of organisms that are within inside the net. So whether they're looking for birds, whether they're looking for plants, this is netting is typically though going to be for like insects and birds. Another one is point control. So in point control, what a scientist is going to do is they're going to stand in the center. They're going to create a couple different circles, and then they're going to split those areas and count within those different areas. This one's a little more complicated. It's a little easier to see if you're doing it in person, but this is a great way to, count those bigger organisms. So we can count trees this way. We can count raccoons this way. It's a great way to count all things like that. Okay. Another great one is area searches. So just picking, an area, determining what that shape of that area is going to be, and then kind of doing like a random search throughout that area and counting the different organisms that you see. The biggest thing with population monitoring is that when a scientist is going through this area, they are typically looking for one type of organism when they're going through this area. They're not looking to count all the trees, all the raccoons, all the birds, all the insects. They're just looking for one organism, and that's how they're monitoring that population, and that's how they're determining whether or not a conservation effort is working. If, in some of these organisms, they might be the keystone species that they're looking for, okay? So if they can control, that, oh, yes, this conservation effort's working because the keystone species is now thriving, then they know that the rest of the ecosystem is at least starting to be put back into balance. One other one we have is quadrant or transect sampling. This is used a lot of times to determine like small plant life, but a lot of times this is also used in rivers or in lakes to determine like different mussels or different corals or, things on the bottom, different types of snails, things like that. And determine, how many organisms are in an area like that. And then lastly, you guys have probably seen before tracking or tagging or wildlife tracking. So, wild animals will be captured, they'll be assigned with a little tag, and then they'll be, released back into the wild. And then, every so many months, every so many years, scientists will go through, and there's two ways they can do this. They can hopefully find the animals again, or now that we have GPS, they've actually been putting GPS on different, birds and other animals like that, and actually tracking like where they go. This is how we can determine migrant patterns and things like that. So it's, just the technology that we have now to monitor population is really helping with these conservation efforts. All right, so what are natural resources? Natural resources are resources that are used from nature in as close to their natural form as possible. So in areas of a higher population, there are more natural resources utilized, putting an environment at risk. So how do we conserve natural resources? What can we do? All right, so here's what we're going to do to save the natural resources. One, we're going to use renewable resources, okay? So the best thing to do is use renewable energy. So we're going to try to use wind energy. We're going to try to use water energy. We're going to try to use solar energy. These can help to avoid pollution. So we're not trying to get natural gas. We're not trying to get coal, things like that. They're going to emit less CO2 into the air. And then this is going to help lessen the impact on climate change as a whole. And as we know, climate change has a big impact on biodiversity. So it's just, again, as most things in biology are, very cyclical. It's a cycle, okay? Another thing we're going to do is we're going to use sustainable resources. So these are resources that can be replaced as they're being used. So yes, we deforest to build houses or other furniture, things like that, but trees can be replanted. These resources we need to make sure that we're using them sparingly. Okay. And then lastly, what we can do is we can recycle. So this helps to reduce waste and reuses products that would be typically considered waste. It also helps to lower the amount of pollution in landfills and population. I know there's a lot of politics out there about really what do recycling plants do, but the best thing you can do is recycle just within your home. If you have a glass bottle that was empty, like a glass jar from spaghetti or something that was emptied, and you have a bag of noodles that needs to be put into a container, you could use that spaghetti jar and refill it. Just things like that. Recycling, really, the best way to do this is within your own home and to, see what you can do. Right, so here we go. We've got wind energy. Here you've got trees, and then obviously you can replant them. And then here we are, at a recycling center, different things. One of the great things in Michigan is that we recycle all of our pop cans, whereas some other states don't do that. So it's, it's a really great thing that we have. All right, so here are some another restoring biodiversity methods. So we have bioremediation. This is going to be the process of using living organisms to clean up the environment from pollutants. An example of this is going to be microorganisms are going to be used to clean up oil spills, which will allow other organisms to survive. So sometimes oil tankers will spill in the ocean, they'll spill in rivers, things like that. Scientists then take microorganisms that actually eat up oil and put them into the ocean, and they assist with the cleanup process. Another one is going to be biological augmentation. And this is going to be the process of adding predators to an ecosystem. So we talked about those keystone species before, in which will prey on species that have grown out of control. So here's an example. Farmers put ladybugs on their crops because they are going to prey on aphids, and these are going to control the aphid population that destroy a lot of farmers' crops. So as opposed to using a lot of pesticides, farmers will implement ladybugs to help control the aphids. So that's a really great thing that's not going to create any more pollution in the air, not going to affect climate change. We just need to make sure we're also controlling the ladybug population because we don't want them to take out of control. And a last one would be reforestation. Obviously, it's planting of new trees in the deforested area. It's a super sustainable way to of using this resource is to chop down fewer trees in the forest and then immediately plant new saplings, new trees to help move that along. So that's what I have for you guys today. Okay. That's biodiversity for you. If you have any questions, obviously always reach out. I would love to hear what you guys think, what you guys need. Please feel free to jump on live lesson on Thursday, and I look forward to talking to you later. Have a great week.